Hey KBC family, and welcome to Daniel's Side of the Story, where I'm going through that week's chapter of the story, and I just share some of my thoughts and reflections for that week. I hope that you're all doing well for our current stage that we're in right now, going through COVID and also coming up on the Christmas season. I know personally I've been a little bit swamped with half a dozen or so different research papers and assignments all due around the same time. Um, it's making me look forward to Christmas. So, something that was interesting that I thought of this week is I had a presentation that actually made me think about this chapter of the story on a little bit of a different perspective. So I'll talk a little bit about that this week. Is I was giving a presentation on the temple of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and during that time, as I was preparing for this presentation, I was really hit by something that I guess I knew, but it didn't really register in my mind in quite the same way as it did just earlier this week. And it's this, right? The temple, and before the temple, it was the tabernacle. That was God's way of reestablishing his relationship with humanity. I mean, if you look back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, you can see that Adam and Eve had a very special relationship with God in the garden. And then through the fall that we can read in Genesis chapter 3, that relationship was lost. From that point forward, all throughout the story, you can see how God is slowly trying to rebuild this relationship that he has with his creation. He's found making a covenant with Abraham. He's promises that there will be a blessing to all other people. He delivers his people out of slavery in Egypt, and so on and so forth. As we read through the story, we see different moments where God is slowly re-establishing this relationship. And I really see that in chapter 5. Here's the next step. In chapter 5, God expressed a desire for Israel to be a nation of priests. And the priests were people who were specifically chosen to be a mediator between humanity and God. So as humanity would come before God, they would have a priest mediate, and they would relay messages, or they would be the ones to assist in different sacrificial offerings and the whole different religious processes. It was the priest's role to be a mediator, and God wanted his chosen people, Israel, to all be priests, so that the whole nation of Israel could be not only an example on what righteous living looked like, but also they could mediate relationships for the other nations so that they could also connect with God. So the priests had a very special relationship that no other human had with God. And God wanted all of Israel to have that role as a priest. So as God prepared for this moment, for this meeting between him and Israel, he gave them a time of preparation. God tells Moses a message for Israel, and he tells them to prepare for this epic moment where the two will meet, this nation and their God. He gives them 3 days to get ready. Israel had 3 days to prepare for God to appear before them. They had 3 days of waiting before God made his presence known. And he showed that he was really alive in a whole new meaning. As you read through chapter 5, you see that Israel ends up failing. they fall into idolatry, and while God spares their lives, and in a sense, the nation survives, but the nation was no longer allowed to become priests as a whole. The role of a priest was very specific now. Not all of Israel was able to become a priest, a nation of priests. But that's not the end of the story. And when you skip through ahead later on in the story, you find that there was another situation where there was a 3-day waiting period. The second time can be found in the death of Jesus, the 3 days waiting for his resurrection. Of course, his disciples didn't really know what this period of waiting was like. They didn't know what they were waiting for. They were just in a time of confusion and waiting and just an uneasy pause. But through this 3-day period, when God again reveals himself, when Jesus, risen, makes himself known to his disciples, there's a special connection. In 1 Peter 2, Peter explains how we, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, have become a nation in and of ourselves of royal priests. We've become a royal priesthood, meaning that we have this special connection with God. We no longer require a priest to serve as a mediator between ourselves and God. Instead, God has given us a direct access to him. We don't need to have someone come on our behalf because Jesus has already fulfilled that role, and we have become royal priests. And in fact, those who follow Jesus now have that role as a priest to be a mediator for those who don't know God, those who haven't joined that royal priesthood. That's why Jesus tells us to go and make disciples. We are the example of what it means to live a righteous life. That's what we're called to do, is to follow Jesus and to create opportunities for others to have this connection with God. Something that I always appreciate when I read through the story of Scripture is that God remains faithful even when his people aren't. And I think that's really my greatest takeaway from this story is Israel failed. They had this 3-day waiting period, but it didn't end up the way that God wanted it to. But later, there's another 3-day period of waiting. And through that time, the whole world gains the opportunity to join as a royal priest. And that's my big takeaway for this chapter 5 of the story. Thank you for listening. I hope that you really start thinking about how God is working throughout the story of Scripture as a whole, but also how God is working in your own life as well. Until next week, we'll be taking a look at Israel again, and I believe we're probably going to be talking about how Israel, again, isn't always faithful, but I'm sure we'll also be able to see moments where God still is. So until then, stay safe, and I'll be just about running into exams at that point. So keep prayers going for all of our young adults who are in the middle of that exam process, and I'm looking forward to being able to come home and see you all in person, hopefully at some point soon. So until then, bye for now.